Hello, Lothar here. It is November 2024. We've just gone through the first round of PCTA permits for 2025 in the lottery, and the second round of lottery is in January. So if you're not familiar with the process, check out my video on through hiking permits, and good luck in the lottery. This video is going to be the first of several on gear and different types of gear, and as a starting point I would urge any new hiker who's looking at gear to check out the surveys, the hiker surveys that are done on the website at the HalfwayAnywhere. They do annual surveys from hikers, and it's a great source of general information, and you'll get listings of basically all the most popular gear on trail in a nice itemized list. I'm going to be talking about gear that some of that is on those lists, but I'm also going to be talking about the variables that are important to me when I'm deciding equipment for a through hike. And also I would urge you to check out as many sources as possible online. My view is one way. There are lots of other people out there who have slightly different variations on what they would do. I would urge you to basically pick the best things that most resonate with you from each of the different sources. I would be wary of people who say that something like this is absolutely true. You do get people who are very, very firm in their views. I'd also be very, very hesitant when people say, I used to work for a retailer, or I am a retailer, and then assume that what they say afterwards is necessarily absolutely sacrosanct and not, you can't argue with, because also they're coming from their particular views and bias, and they also potentially, if they're selling things, they're going to be pushing some of the items that they sell. That's probably understandable in the commercial world. Just be careful, but I would urge you to look at all sources, as many sources as possible. Now, this video is going to be, this is the introduction to the big three. This is going to be on the shelter or tents or tarps, whichever your choice is. It's going to be on backpacks, and it's going to be on sleep systems. That's the big three, the big real major ticket items that you're probably going to be looking at for your first through hike. Now, what other factors immediately going to cause you problems are what gear you already have. Now, I had that problem. First of all, I've been hiking since I was 10. I have, like many people, just bucket loads of gear, but a lot of it is probably not ideal for through hiking. It's great for short trips, it's great for car camping, and I've got a multitude of sets of gear that actually, when I came to do my first through hike, I decided not very few elements of the gear I had at the time were good enough for a through hike. The difference is you're going to be on trail for a long time, upwards of 100 to 150, or even if you're taking it really steady, up to 200 days, depending on what your pace is. The gear has to be durable and ideally as reasonably light as possible whilst maintaining that durability. You also have to look at your style. What is going to be your style of hiking? Are you going to be going for an uber light approach? You want to trim down everything. Are you going for a minimum base weight? The word of warning I would say on there is that I've gone through the phases where I had heavy gear, then I went to literally down to sub 10 pounds base weight. That's basically gear without food and water. Very minimalist. And I found that I can do it. I can hike with minimalist gear, but I don't enjoy it. I don't get the recovery, good night's sleep all the time, and it's not for everybody. If you're going to go ultralight, give yourself a lot of preparation time and training, and basically doing shakedown hikes as much as possible to make sure the ultralight approach works for you on trail. Certainly if you're going to be on trail for 100 to 150 days. I would also urge you to think about the gear. There are certain interrelations with some of the big three. So obviously if you're going to go for a very minimalist shelter approach, then you might dial up the spec on your sleep system. So you might go for a nice warm sleeping bag if you're going for a minimalist type shelter system. Same with the backpacks. You see some hikers with very small, tiny little backpacks, maybe 30, 40 litres. That's the uber light people. Again, takes a lot of work to do that and make that work, but it also means that you decide what size backpack you're going to buy. Now, if as a general advice is, I would say, what are the worst conditions you've got to deal with on trail? And they are going to be in the Sierra. Now, that's where you're going to have to carry a tent or shelter system in some respect that's going to potentially ride out a snowstorm if you have to. It's got to carry a bear can of reasonable size, and you've got to be able to basically have enough volume to store all your cold weather gear and things like that. And I think in reality that normally sets a limit of you've got to have a backpack of a capability of maybe 50, 55, sometimes even 60 litres, depending on your approach. And I would look at, say, backpacks which have these roll top sort of features, whereby you can basically have a higher volume pack, but if you're, say, in the desert for the first part of the trail, you only need maybe 40, 45 litres, you can roll it down. So I'll talk about those kind of packs later on. The other thing is budget. You've got to decide where you're going to put your money. Or are you going to buy a medium? You're going to put some of your money towards the tent, some of your money towards the sleep system, some of your money towards the backpack. I will talk about the priorities. I personally prioritize the shelter, because some of the tents I had, I mean, before I hiked, I had a tent like this. This is actually it's a bit like a big agonist. This happens to be an example of a quarter dome. These are double skin tents that have very complex poles. They're relatively heavy, and I decided very early on that I was going to go for an ultralight tent. Now that is something like a duplex. There are lots of brands out there. I will go in detail on the specific tents, or some of the specific tents, later on. But again, I decided to put most of my money, or certainly on my initial spend, on getting a very good sleep system that would work for me, and I could dial it in. I could manage the condensation because it's a single skin tent, and I made various decisions around that then decided, right, how am I going to tailor my sleep system, and what size backpack do I think is reasonable. Now, the thing to think about for backpacks is, the biggest thing is this thing, is your bear can. This is the kind of bear cans you're going to be looking at. So your gear, your backpack certainly has the volume, either to have this inside the main compartment, or what a lot of people do is also, maybe when they're hiking, they put their quilt in, or the sleeping bag, which is the light thing, have that on the top of the backpack behind their heads, and when they get to camp, then they put the food into the bear can. Now, don't be tempted, this is my view, don't be tempted to go for the minimalist bear can like this for the Sierra, because this, if you're going to follow the rules correctly, you've got to put all your food in your bear can. You'd probably have to resupply pretty much every exit if you have this kind of size bear can. I wouldn't recommend this kind of bear can for the Sierra, because you're going to have long resupply routes, and this is kind of flouting the rules if you use one of these and you're going through for long distances, because you can't realistically get long resupply duration food supplies into something this size. If you can, then good for you. I think the vast majority of hikers would struggle, so don't look at these. Just as a side note, with bear cans, I would look at buying a bear can, if I was being honest, or look at something like the Bear Can Cooperative. This was a initiative set up by Trail Angel in response to some shenanigans that went on in previous years, where retailers that rented out bear cans actually withheld deposits under certain circumstances, and that was frowned upon by a lot of hikers, myself in particular, I think, because it affected a lot of foreign hikers, and I appreciate that maybe retailers don't want to talk about that occurrence. I think that maybe they've improved their processes for 2025, but we haven't had a clear acknowledgement that this happened, and whilst they're not willing to basically admit that they made mistakes, and they admit that they still owe people's deposits back, I would urge you to not go for rentals. I would go for buying or getting a loaner from a Trail Angel. The other advantage is, if you have bear cans, you can then either sell it or give it to a Trail Angel for future hikers in next year. Anyway, right, I'm just looking at my notes here. Style of hiking, that's going to be a big issue. If you're going to be ultralight, then you probably want to go, and you're going to go fast, you probably do want to trim your gear down as much as possible. Now, when it comes to certain types of gear, let's look at the philosophy is lighter necessarily faster. If you go ultralight, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to hike faster. It also means you're going to have fewer comforts, such that when you come to recover at night, you're going to be dealing with minimalist equipment. I personally, as I said previously, can go down to 10 pounds base weight, but I settle on about anywhere between 16 to 18 pounds base weight, because I like my comforts. I like the fact that I can recover. I've got the gear to recover at night. I've got some extra luxuries, and I can basically confirm that my hike duration in terms of my the time on trail and my hike speed changes very little whether I have a 10-pound pack or an 18-pound base weight pack. And I now typically hike around 100 days, sub 100. Previously I did 110, 115 days, and I find that it's very difficult to make it any shorter, and going lighter doesn't make any difference, certainly in my case. So I've got that philosophy now. I can go light when I want to. In certain parts, maybe it's in the desert, I might have my small pack when I'm hiking, because I'm lucky I've got multiple packs. But when I get to Tehachapi, which is just before the Sierra, I send my heavy pack, knowing full well that's what's going to get me through the Sierra, and I normally just keep that pack to the end of the trail. So that means if you're going for one set of gear, then you've got to think, as I've said before, you've got to have gear that's going to get you through the Sierra. Let's get on to the shelters. Let's discuss my approach to shelters. Now, I have a multitude of gear in my stores, and so let's talk through the various options that you might want to consider, and you may want to try on trail or in your shakedown hikes. Now, let's go back to the basics. You could ultimately cowboy camp. Now, a lot of hikers, what they do is when the weather's very good, there's no storms coming and it's not going to be too cold at night, they might choose to cowboy camp, and that's basically they lay out maybe like a Tyvek sheet or a ground mat and then sleep on the mat looking at the stars. It's a wonderful thing to do, but it's not something that I can do literally for the whole trail. There were certain nights where I decide, yep, I will cowboy camp, but I personally always go for a shelter of some description. The next level up from cowboy camping might be having a tarp. Now, that's a tarpaulin is basically a sheet of fabric. This is a very minimalist Dyneema, very lightweight tarpaulin. Basically, it can be created sort of A-frame type tent shape, but it's literally just a roof. You basically lay a string across maybe 2 trees, or you might use your trekking poles as the support. And this weighs pretty much next to nothing. This is again the next level up. Now, you can also pitch this high, or you can pitch it very low to the ground, so if there's rain coming you can make sure you're not going to get splashes coming in, but it's not offering enclosed protection. So some people might have a bug net, so they might actually take something like this, which is a basic bug net, which basically is like a triangular bug net that you literally can hang underneath this to form basic shelter and have bug protection. So this is probably what I would consider to be the ultralight approach. Now, some people might also take an approach whereby they have a bivy bag, or type of bivy bag. Now, this is where it's a shelter where you have a basin and it has maybe a mesh net or something like that, this is kind of like a covering, but it's still an enclosed system, and it's a bivy bag, or this is kind of like a bivy bag. It's basically called a bug nest, in that you've got the waterproof bottom so you've got waterproof protection, and then there's a mesh coming up above you, so you've got the bug protection, and then if you combine that with a tarpaulin, you've got the effectively a tent. But again, this combination allows you to use just the bug net in perfect conditions. You maybe have this if you think there's probably light rain and no bugs, or you can combine the two. There's lots of sort of variation with this, so you'll see people using equipment like this. It's very light. Now, the next level up from that might be what's called a single skin tent. Now, this is a duplex. This is a single skin tent from Z-Packs. It is made from DCF or Dyneema fabric, very lightweight, very expensive as well, but personally, this is my tent of choice, and you'll find, I think, very high up on the surveys. It is very strong and durable, and again, I think it is probably the most popular tent on trail. It can be pitched with poles, or it can be pitched using trekking poles, so that can eliminate the need to carry extra poles. You can also set this up with what's called a freestanding set of poles, where basically you've got a set of poles like this, which is very long, quite heavy, and they will interlock into basically where the pegs go, and it actually creates a tension within the system, so you can actually literally pick the tent up and it's freestanding. I personally don't use these at all. I found that I don't necessarily need them, so the idea of maybe if you want a tent that's freestanding, I wouldn't go out of my way to buy one. If it turns out to be a feature of the tent you choose, that's great. But I wouldn't focus on people. Well, some people will say, "Oh, I must have a freestanding tent," or "I love the element of a freestanding tent." I would say just learn to pitch a tent on trail, and you will very quickly within the first few days or a week or so of trail. If you're not familiar with your tent, you will get very familiar very quickly. And there is no desperate need for a freestanding tent on the Pacific Crest Trail. There are lots of places where you can pitch a tent without any issues whatsoever. So this is an example. This is a 2-person tent. So do I get a 1-person or a 2-person tent? Again, if you're going to be on trail for long periods and potentially have to ride out some storms, I personally love the idea that this is a 2-person tent. It is super light and I have space such that I can spread out in my tent. And again, you'll find a lot of hikers deferring to a 2-person tent because they're on trail for so long, and having a 2-person tent makes a difference and has that extra comfort. I also have a 1-person DCF. This is even lighter. This requires 2 poles or 2 trekking poles to put it up. This particular tent requires 1 pole to put it up, or 1 trekking pole to put it up. It is super lightweight. It is single skin again, but it's 1-person designed for 2 people. This particular one. I actually still defer to my 2-person tent. I keep this one as a backup. Both these are what are called single skin tents. So the downside of tents like this is that because you have a single wall, and if it's cold outside, if you have hot breath when you're breathing through the night and it's very cold on the outside, your breath will condense on the inside and you'll get problems of condensation. So the factor you have to prepare for is, if you're going to invest in any tents like this, single wall, and they're very good, just be prepared for the fact there's going to be occasions where you have to manage condensation. And that is done by simply opening the doors and slightly so that you have an airflow. Now, some people have made the mistake, and I personally think it's a mistake, whereby they've bought these tents and then taken them to places where it's very rainy, it's very miserable. I wouldn't personally use a duplex, a single skin tent, on say the 80, because it rains a lot, so there's going to be lots of condensation issues. I probably wouldn't use one in Scotland. They're not really good. I probably have a 2-skin for places where I know condensation is going to be an issue, because a 2-skin tent has an extra barrier whereby your breath is not going to condense on a layer that's in direct contact with the cold weather outside. So coming into the 2-layer tents, this is an example. This is like the Big Agnes and the Quarter Domes. These are tents that allow you to basically set up an inner tent. Now, if the weather's good, you may not only need to set that up, but if the weather's potentially bad, then you can have a second fly cover that goes over the top. The issues with these kind of tents is, one, they're heavier because it's obviously 2-layer. The second thing is that they normally have quite complex pole systems. Now, this particular one has almost like a spider-like multi-element pole system, such that they take time to set up rather than just simply using a trekking pole. But the other issue is that if you do damage them, it is very, very tricky to actually repair them on trail if the poles fail. Whereas if you have, say, a tent that requires just a trekking pole or a single pole, a stick is enough to pitch something like a duplex or a single skin tent like that. Or the other brand I was going to say is the Durstons. Is very popular this year. Now you can use, when using trekking poles, you might think, oh, how do I get the right height trekking pole for my tent? Well, obviously, if you've got trekking poles like this, which have the full height adjustment, then that's very easy to do. You can obviously just set that easily to the height of the tent required. If you have fixed length trekking poles, don't necessarily mean it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a problem getting near the height you want for your tent, because fixed length trekking poles are literally, as I said, by definition, fixed length. They normally have different hand positions. You've got rubber here, here and here, and cork, so you can move your hand up and down. So as you're going up and down, you can change your position of the hands on the trekking pole. But you have the fixed height, but you also have, if you unlock it, this has a locking mechanism, it then means you can compress the pole by probably about another 8 to 10 centimeters, which takes you to another height range that might match your tent. So don't get too worried if your trekking poles aren't perfectly matched to the required height of the tent, and you don't necessarily always have to buy the perfect height poles for your tent, because a lot of the time you're going to be pitching your tent the normal height, but you might want to pitch it lower if the weather's bad, so to stop rain splashes in. And in those circumstances, I use fixed poles, fixed length trekking poles for my tents. I unlock them so that the height can reduce to the minimum, and then if the height is not close to, say, a duplex, and then I can angle it slightly under the tent, and you can actually easily get within the height requirements for most of the single or trekking pole tents that I've used. Anyway, the next one is ground sheets. So if you're going to invest in a tent, be it a one person, two person, be it a double skin or single skin, you might think, oh, I want to have protection underneath my tent, underneath the basin, which is the waterproof element. Now I tend to use a Tyvek sheet. This is simply just a building material Tyvek sheet, very lightweight, multi-purpose. This gives me enough protection on the basin of my tent, and I just basically literally just cut it to size. I would urge you not to invest in these tent footprints that companies sell. You're basically spending a lot of money on something that can easily be replaced by a piece of Tyvek sheet. And the fact that they may clip into things, that's great. So what? You just need literally something that's going to protect the basin of your tent. Tent footprints are an unnecessary cost, in my personal opinion. The other thing I would urge you to consider is a set of pegs or stakes, something like this. This is a Groundhog MSR Groundhog Mini. They are great because they have basically a complex shape that can bind into the ground and give you reasonably good, binding point for pitching your tents or your shelter of any of your shelter of choice. I would urge you to not invest in these very thin shepherd's crook type pegs that are super ultralight, but they offer very little traction. So if the ground is a little bit moist, they'll just literally don't hold the tension. This is probably the one extravagance I would say on all my kit. I would get something like the MSR Groundhogs, these shapes. I've hiked the last 4 seasons on the PCT, and these have served me well. So I would urge you to invest in these and not go for these super ultralight. Even if they're carbon fibre ones, I think again they look like a pencil, but they're useless. They have no real binding. And I've tried multiple variants of them, and I still defer back to the MSR Groundhogs. I would also carry a repair kit. So if you're going to go for some of these DCF carbon fibre type tents, then you can get what's called seam seal tape. It's basically very flexible tape. It's not tenacious tape. Tenacious tape is much more rigid. Seam seal tape you can get from companies like Z-Packs, and it's literally just a very sticky a piece of DCF that allows you to tape up any sort of if you have a tear or a puncture in your tent, and they're very effective, and I use that regularly to repair my tents. If you go for a tent that is made from other fabrics like sil nylon, then you probably have to look at the manufacturer's recommendations. They may recommend tenacious tape or some other thing, but DCF tape doesn't work so well on the sil nylon. The other thing, another indulgence I have, and it's certainly not a weight indulgence, is if you look at this duplex, this is the tent bag. This is not the original tent bag that came with the tent, because what you'll find sometimes is you'll buy a tent and you'll get the manufacturer's bag, and unless you pack it beautifully, perfectly, it's almost like a fight. It's a wrestling match to get it back in the original bag. Now I've found that and over the years I just literally get one of my old storage bags, or I buy one slightly bigger, or something like this, which is a roll top one, which allows you to roll top down to such that it's slightly bigger than the one that comes with the tent, so I'm not having a wrestling match every time I pack up first thing in the morning. Slightly bigger bag makes life so much easier, and I think the roll top approach is probably easier, and it's it's lightweight, doesn't weigh anything, weighs next to nothing. Another big thing I would say on tents is when you pack them up, roll up and fold the tents. If you've invested in an expensive tent, do not stuff the fabric of a tent into a bag. The reason being is because you are driving the fabric against elements inside the tent, be it one of the buckles, be it one of the points where the peg goes through, be it one of the tension adjusters. If you're randomly driving that fabric against the tent day after day after day, after at the end of so when you wake up in the morning and you're packing your stuff away, you risk damaging your tent every single day. I would urge you to roll and fold. and gradually sort of don't put too much compression on the tent, and push it into the slightly larger bag that I mentioned, and look after your tent. Now that was drummed into me when I was about 10 by my scout leader. You never stuff a tent, you always roll and fold. And it's funny how you might, over the years, I've kind of seen some of these big names like Homemade Wonderlust and Darwin, other people, and they talk about packing tents, and so occasionally you'll see them say, oh, we're stuffing tents, and thankfully most of them have actually now endorsed the fact you don't stuff a tent if you want it to last. It's almost like there are certain elements of camping and hiking that probably each generation has to go through a learning process, which is a bit of a shame, but I said I was lucky enough to get that drummed into me when I was 10 by my scout leader, and I would urge you to never stuff a tent. Roll and fold. And the proof in the pudding is this is a duplex, and this has been on the PCT for 4 seasons, so 3.5 or almost 4 through hikes, and it's the same tent. Yes, I've had to repair it. Yes, I had to replace the zip, but I looked after this, and this is still going. So you can make a very expensive piece of equipment last a very long time if you're careful. If you're looking at gear, maybe slightly lower budget, you may kind of want the equivalent of some of these expensive tents, but you can't afford it, so you might go for top tents and things like this. Be very careful if you're looking at suppliers that say, oh, we'll send you a seam seal kit. So they may send the shelter, but it hasn't been fully waterproofed, and that means they're going to send you a kit with a little tube of basically silicone that you can basically use a little brush, and you paint on the silicone into the seams to create the waterproofing. I honestly would urge you to steer well clear of that approach unless you are experienced in it. It is messy. I've done it twice and I hate it every time. The first time I did it was a minor disaster. You found that it didn't gel well. It was literally silicone everywhere. It was hot. I just don't enjoy it, and I would urge you, if you're going to invest in something decent, something going to last you for 100-150 days, make sure it's seam sealed by the manufacturer. That would be my advice. I do have some stuff, as I said, I'm manually seam sealed. I'd only ever use that at weekends, and only as a last resort. Anyway, you take your choice. Whatever shelter system you use, I would urge you to do some shakedown hikes and practice hikes. Learn to pitch to your tent or shelter, whatever shelter you're using, at different heights. And as I've said, there's going to be so many different variables. If you want to, if it's going to be a hot day, if you want to try cowboy camping, do an element of cowboy camping in your shakedown hikes, and also learn the process whereby you're packing things up. You pack things up in a process, so you're not going to make sure you pick up your pegs, and make sure you've your trekking poles. You can actually get your trekking pole, the selected trekking poles, to the right height if you need to, and actually practice also, just because I had one situation this year where I broke one of my trekking poles. So for a couple of nights I actually was just hiking along, and when I knew I was going to camp, I was just looking out for a particular stick, and I then put a sock on the top of the stick so it didn't actually dig into the tent where it was going into the roof, and I used that as an emergency shelter, so a sort of support for the tent, and it worked absolutely fine. So other thing about tents or sleep systems of any description is take care of the zips. Try not to let them fall into the dirt too much. It's inevitable they will, but any debris get in there, you're then running the risk of snagging the zips, and I've only had that happen to me twice, but it's very frustrating when it does happen. Sometimes you can recover it, and I had one occasion where I had to send my tent away and actually get it repaired at the end of a hike. There are solutions to temporarily fixing zips, which I'll talk about, which has saved me a few times. But if you can, lubricate your zips. Just there's zip lubrication you can use, because it is the most used item. It goes all the time, and if you get debris in there, that's the thing that damages most. But don't panic too much. It doesn't happen very often. It's frustrating when it does. The last thing I would say is certainly if you have a shelter that has a basin, which is like a waterproof layer, it's very easy to get punctures in that, and that's why, as I said, I use a Tyvek sheet to protect it as much as possible from rocks and sharpy things from the underneath. But actually be careful in the desert, because you can actually inadvertently walk sharp items into your tent if you keep your shoes on. because there are seed pods like goat heads, which are basically very tiny little seeds that have got very sharp and very strong spikes that stick into your shoes. And then what can happen is you then have, if you bring your shoes into the tent, occasionally they might fall off and they can puncture things, either be your basin of your tent, and sometimes they're probably responsible for puncturing sleeping pads early on in the desert. So just be careful that when you're getting into your shelter system, whatever it is, that you're checking your shoes and you don't have any sharp items like or cactus spines that are stuck in your shoes are going to be potentially causing damage. That's the only thing I would think about. So that I think is going to be just an initial introduction on shelters. I hope that's helpful to you. The brands I personally look at are Z-Plex Duplex. I have an Altaplex. I love the brand. There are slightly cheaper versions of the Durstons. I think they are looking really good this year. They are a good alternative if you don't want to stump up for the Z-Pax ones. There are the big, so the budget ones might be the Big Agnes ones. Again, very popular if your budget can't extend to the more expensive tents. Perfectly feasible to use on thru-hikes and very popular. There's Nemo tents, there's REI tents. Now that's probably getting towards the heavier end, but appreciate that's part of the reason why I choose to put most of my money initially in the shelter system, and I choose to look after it, take care of it, and it has served me well. So I will stop there. I will move on to sleep systems and backpacks in the next video. And if there's other comments or other questions you might have about gear, please put them in the comments below, and I will try and address them in future videos. Okay, speak to you soon.